The pitcher was too heavy for one hand, and Lady Uspel knew it when she pressed it into mine. "Pour for our guests, Sable," she said, smiling the way frost smiles on a window pane, bright and without warmth. "You stand there so prettily doing nothing else." Laughter rippled down the high table of Duncrag like a struck bell. I did not laugh. I gripped the clay handle with both hands and walked the length of the hall, past 40 visiting nobles in their velvet and their rings, while my own steward, Master Corin, stood by the wine casks with his arms folded, and a satisfaction on his face he did not bother to hide. He had arranged the seating. He had arranged this. I understood that the moment Uspel's cousin, Lord Petrine, lifted his cup toward me and said, loud enough for the rafters to catch it, "Careful, girl, don't spill on the good cloth. That's finer than anything you'll ever wear." I had known, from the moment Corin summoned me from the scullery an hour before the feast, that something was being arranged at my expense. He had handed me a clean apron himself, which he never did, and told me I would help serve the high table tonight instead of clearing trenchers in the kitchen where I belonged. An honor, he had called it, in a voice that made the word taste like a lie before I had even opened my mouth to answer. I had learned to read Corin's courtesies, the way sailors learn to read a changing sky. Kindness from him always meant a storm coming for someone, and I had known, standing there with the apron strings still in my hands, that the someone would be me. I had not known it would be Lady Uspel who visited Duncrag that week seeking an alliance for her house, nor that she would arrive already irritated to find the Alpha King's Hall staffed by servants who did not fawn over her the way her own household did. She had noticed me within an hour of her arrival, noticed the way some high-born women notice anything that does not immediately arrange itself around their comfort, and I had felt her attention on me the way one feels a draft under a door, cold and persistent and impossible to fully block out. By the time the feast began, she had decided, it seemed, that I would be the evening's entertainment. I had scrubbed floors in this hold since I was 12 years old. I had learned long before tonight that the only armor a servant owns is her own steadiness. So I kept my spine straight, kept the pitcher level, and poured. At the high table, Alpha King Silas sat with his hands still around an untouched cup, watching the hall the way a man watches whether coming off the sea, quiet, assessing, already knowing it would not simply pass by. He had been Alpha King of Duncrag for 11 years since his father's death, and in that time I had heard every manner of story about him whispered through the kitchens, that he was too solemn, too slow to marry, too careful with his heart for a man who owed his hold and heir. I had never put much stock in kitchen whispers. I knew him only as a shape at the high table, a low voice thanking the kitchen staff on feast nights when other lords never bothered, a man who noticed when a fire needed building up in the servants' hall in the dead of winter, and quietly ordered more wood sent down without being asked. I had thought him decent, in the distant way one thinks well of weather that has, so far, been kind. I had never once imagined he thought of me at all. I had served him wine perhaps a dozen times in 3 years, and never once met his eyes. Servants did not. But some cruelty in Petrine's laughter made me falter as I reached the end of the table nearest the king, my wrist twisting a fraction as I tipped the pitcher toward a stranger's cup, and it was in that half-second of unsteadiness that I felt it, not clumsiness, not fear, but a warmth that did not belong to me, spreading up through my palm from the clay itself, as though the pitcher had been sitting in sunlight for an hour rather than resting all evening on cold stone. I nearly dropped it. I did not know yet what that warmth was. I only knew that when I looked up, startled, Alpha King Silas was no longer watching the hall. He was watching me. "Again," Lady Uspel said, delighted, mistaking my stumble for entertainment. "Go on, Sable. Lord Petrine's cup wants filling." A young lord I did not know, seated near Petrine, leaned back in his chair to get a better look at me, the way one leans back to better view a horse being led around a ring. "Where did you find her, Uspel? She pours like she's afraid the wine will bite." She's afraid of everything, Uspel said. It's rather the charm of her. Dunkrag keeps her the way other holds keep a nervous hound. Isn't that right, girl? I said nothing. I had learned long ago that silence cost less than defense, that any word I offered in my own favor only gave people like Uspel more to laugh at. So I let the laughter pass over me the way rain passes over stone, and I turned back to the task because turning back was the only thing I knew how to do. I had spent my whole life turning back to the task. My mother had died in this hold's kitchens with flour still on her hands. My father I had never known, and Dunkrag had raised me the way it raised its stray cats, feeding me enough to keep me useful and expecting nothing more of me than usefulness. I did not expect kindness at this feast. I expected to survive it the way I survived every day here, by being small and quick and unnoticed. But the warmth in the pitcher's handle did not fade. If anything, it climbed higher, curling around my wrist like a bracelet made of low firelight. And when I chanced one more glance at the high table, the king had risen. The hall did not notice at first. Conversation continued, wine sloshed. Someone was midway through a story about a hunting hound. It was only when Silas stepped down from the dais down, where kings did not go, where only servants and hounds and the humble went, that the nearest tables fell silent, and the silence spread outward like water finding the low places in a floor. I did not understand. I stood frozen with the pitcher still tilted over Lord Petrine's cup. Wine dripping unwanted onto the tablecloth Petrine had just warned me not to spoil. And I watched my king cross his own hall on his own 2 feet, past nobles who scrambled half upright in confusion, past Master Corin, whose satisfied face had gone the color of ash, until he stood before me close enough that I could see the low firelight of the hall caught gold in his eyes. Every step he took seemed to take an age, and yet none at all. I remember thinking absurdly that I ought to curtsy, ought to step back, ought to do any of the small automatic things a servant does when a great lord draws near, and instead I simply stood there, pitcher tilted, wine still dripping, because some part of me already understood that this was not a moment for the old rules. Petrine had gone still in his chair. Lady Uspel's hand had frozen halfway to her own cup. Even the hounds dozing near the hearth lifted their heads, ears pricked, as though they too felt the air in the hall change shape. "Give me the pitcher," he said, quietly. Not a command shouted for effect, but a request made only to me, as though we were the only 2 people in the room. "My lord," I began. "Sable," he said my name like he had been saying it every day of his life instead of never at all. "Give me the pitcher." My hands obeyed before my mind caught up to why. The moment his fingers closed over the clay handle, over the very place where the warmth had gathered beneath my own skin, that warmth surged into something else entirely, not heat now but recognition, an unmistakable click like a key finding the one lock built for it, and I felt it settle behind my ribs with the quiet finality of a door closing softly rather than slamming. Not a howl, not a surge. Just a settling, the way a bird stops circling once it finds its branch. I have heard other alphas speak of the mate bond as thunder, as fire, as something violent that seizes a man and shakes him. Mine did not come as thunder. It came as stillness, as though some restless thing in me that had been pacing my whole life long had simply, finally, sat down. Silas took the pitcher from my hands entirely. Then, before 400 eyes and the stunned breath of his own hall, the Alpha King of Dunkrag turned to me, found my empty cup, the plain one, the servant's cup, chipped at the rim, set apart at the foot of the table where I was meant to fill others, but never my own, and he filled it. He poured for me. No one in that hall moved. I heard the fire crack in the great hearth. I heard someone's cup set down too hard on wood. I did not hear Lady Uspel laugh again. "My lord," I whispered because it was all I had, "you mustn't. I am only—" "You are not only asterisk anything," he said, and though his voice was low it carried to every corner of that hall the way a struck bell carries, effortless, impossible to unhear. You have poured wine in this hall for 3 years, and I let it happen because I did not know how to look at you without every noble in my keep asking why their king stares at a serving girl. I have no such excuse tonight. Tonight I know exactly why." He set the pitcher down. He did not take my hand. He was too careful a man to claim anything from me in front of a crowd that had just spent an hour trying to shrink me. But he stood close, and he looked at me the way no one at Dunkrag had ever looked at me, as though I were the only lit window in a dark house. "You felt it," he said, not a question. "I don't know what I felt," I admitted, because lying to him seemed suddenly like the one thing I could not do, not with that settled warmth still humming quietly under my ribs. Only that the pitcher was warm, and then it wasn't the pitcher at all. "It is called many things," he said. "My grandmother called it the coming home feeling. I have waited 11 years to know if I would ever feel it for anyone." He glanced briefly at the high table, at Lady Uspel gone pale in her seat, at Petrine's mouth hanging open around words he had wisely decided not to finish. I did not expect to feel it while watching a girl humiliated for the amusement of guests who mistake cruelty for wit. Master Corin found his voice from somewhere near the wine casks. "My king, it was only a small jest, It was meant to wound her," Silas said, without raising his voice, without even turning fully toward the steward, and somehow that quietness was worse than any shout could have been. "You seated my guests to enjoy it. You will explain to me later why you believed that was a fitting welcome for anyone under my roof, let alone her." He did not call for punishment. He did not need to. I watched the color drain from Corin's face as though the king's calm had done more damage than rage ever could. Lady Uspel rose halfway from her seat, some old habit of composure trying to reassert itself. "Your Grace, we meant no true harm, it was only—" "I know what it was only," Silas said. "I have decided it is finished." He looked back to me before she could answer, and something in his face gentled entirely, all the iron gone out of it, as though I were the only person left in the hall worth speaking to softly. "Will you sit, Sable, not at the foot of the table, beside me?" The young lord who had spoken of me as though I were a nervous horse now stared at his own plate as though it might offer him somewhere to hide. Petrine had set down his cup entirely, and folded his hands as though hoping stillness might make him invisible, an irony that was not lost on me, since invisibility was the very thing I had spent my whole life perfecting, and he had mocked me for wanting it. No one at that table laughed now. The silence in the hall had a texture to it, thick as the tallow smoke curling up from the sconces, and I understood dimly that whatever had just happened could not be undone by any apology offered after the fact. I had poured wine at that table for 3 years and never once imagined sitting at it. My hands, empty now of the pitcher, did not know what to do with themselves. "My lord, I don't know the customs of the high table. I would shame you." "You have never shamed anyone in your life," he said. "You have only ever been shamed by people too small to recognize what stood in front of them. I recognize you. That is the only custom that matters tonight." I do not remember deciding to walk beside him. I remember only that when I did, the hum beneath my ribs brightened, the way embers brighten when a door lets in a draft, and that every step toward the dais felt less like trespass and more like arrival, as if some part of me had been walking toward that chair for years without knowing the path. He pulled the seat out himself. Not a servant, not Corin, not anyone but the Alpha King of Dunkrag, drawing a chair back for a girl who an hour before had been mocked for daring to stand near that same table. I sat. The hall remained silent, 40 nobles and their attendants watching a reversal none of them had scripted, and I felt every eye on me the way I had felt eyes on me all my life, except this time I did not want to disappear beneath the weight of them. This time the king sat down beside me, close enough that his shoulder nearly brushed mine, and the warmth of the bond steadied rather than fled, and I understood, with a clarity that arrived like dawn arrives, all at once and impossible to argue with, that I was not being watched as a curiosity tonight. I was being watched as his asterisk. Eat, Sela said gently, sliding a plate toward me that some hovering attendant had not dared touch since the feast began. You have fed this hall for 3 years. Let it feed you tonight. I ate, my hands shook only a little. Somewhere down the table, Lord Petrine had gone very interested in his own cup, and Lady Uspel sat with her chin lifted in the brittle way of someone pretending composure she no longer possessed, and neither of them spoke another word to me for the rest of that feast. I did not feel triumphant watching their discomfort. I felt, instead, a strange and unfamiliar mercy toward them. They had wanted to make me small, and instead they had simply revealed how small the making required them to be. That was punishment enough. I did not need to watch them suffer for it. I only wanted, for the first time in my life, to be warm. Later, when the feast thinned and guests retired to the chambers prepared for them, Silas walked me from the hall himself, past the kitchens where I had spent half my life, out into the covered walk where the night air smelled of wood smoke and the frost just beginning to silver the stone. You will not serve at my table again, he said, unless you choose to serve because you wish it, not because Corin or anyone else commands it of you. And if I choose to keep serving, I asked, I do not know how to be anything else. I have scrubbed and poured and carried since I could carry. Then you will do it as a woman with a place here, not as a girl without one. He stopped walking and turned to face me fully, and in the moonlight I saw for the first time how tired his eyes were beneath the crown's weight, how long he must have sat at that high table waiting for a feeling he had stopped expecting to arrive. I am not asking you to become someone else tonight, Sable. I am only telling you I finally see who you already are. You don't know me, I said, quiet, honest. You've spoken more words to me in the last hour than in 3 years. Then let me spend longer knowing you than I spent not, he said. I am not asking for tonight to answer everything. I am asking you to let me try. The bond hummed warmer at that, not urgent, not demanding, only patient like a hearth banked for the night that would still be glowing come morning. I thought of my mother, who had died with flour on her hands and no one to grieve her but me. I thought of every year I had made myself small enough to be overlooked, because being overlooked was safer than being seen and found wanting. And I thought that perhaps, for the first time, being seen did not have to mean being found wanting at all. I would like that, I said, slowly, though I don't yet know how to be looked at like this. Slowly then, he agreed, and something in his face eased, as though slowness itself were a gift I had given him rather than a condition. I have waited 11 years, Sable. I can wait a little longer to walk beside you properly. We stood in the cold together a while longer, not touching, the bond a low, steady warmth between us like a lamp left burning in a window for someone expected home. Somewhere behind us, in the great hall, servants were already clearing the tables where I had once stood pouring wine for people who thought me beneath their notice. I did not go back to help them that night. For the first time since I was 12 years old, no one expected me to. In the days that followed, Dunkrag learned to look at me differently, though not all at once, and not without some resistance from those who preferred the old order where I moved unseen through corridors and served without being served. Master Corin avoided my eyes entirely for a week, until Silas asked him plainly whether he intended to spend the rest of his service flinching from a girl he had once thought harmless enough to mock, and after that Corin began, awkwardly, to greet me by name. Lady Uspel left Dunkrag 3 days after the feast, her visit cut shorter than planned, though she did stop me once in the covered walk to say, stiffly, that she had not known, and that not knowing was a poor excuse but the only one she had. I told her I accepted it, because I found I did not want to carry her shame alongside my own old scars. It was enough that she carried it herself now. It was not only the visiting nobles who required convincing. On the 4th morning after the feast, I was summoned, properly summoned this time, by a page sent to fetch me rather than by Corin's cold courtesies, to the small council chamber where Silas met with the elders of his own pack, men and women who had known him since he was a boy learning to carry his father's weight before he was ready for it. I stood in the doorway in my plain gray dress, hands folded the way I had folded them for every scolding I had ever received in that hold, and braced myself for another version of the hall's judgment, only quieter, only more official. "You wish us to believe," said an elder named Master Aldwin, a broad, gray-bearded man who had served Silas's father before him, "that the bond simply arrived, my king, in the middle of a feast, over wine you did not even ask for." "I do not ask you to believe it," Silas said. "I ask you to accept it because it is true whether you accept it or not. I felt it the moment I touched that pitcher. I have not stopped feeling it since." He glanced toward me briefly, the warmth behind my ribs answering the glance the way a struck string answers another tune to it. "You have known me 11 years, Aldwin. Have you ever known me to mistake what I feel for what I wish to feel?" Aldwin was quiet a long moment. "No," he admitted. "You have always been maddeningly certain of your own mind." "Then trust that certainty now." Silas did not raise his voice, did not plead, only stated the matter as plainly as he might state the weather. "I do not require the council's permission to claim my mate. I have come to you instead because I would rather Dunkrag stand behind her than merely tolerate her, and that requires you to know her as I am coming to know her, not merely to hear that I have chosen her." An older woman at the end of the table, whom I would later come to know as Elder Fenwin, studied me for a long moment with eyes that missed very little. "Girl," she said, not unkindly, "why did you never ask for more than scullery work in 11 years under this roof? A clever servant angles for the steward's favor, for softer duties, for notice. You did none of that." The question startled me more than any accusation could have. I considered it honestly before I answered, because it deserved an honest answer. Because asking for notice never once brought me anything but disappointment, I said. "My mother taught me before she died that the safest place in any hold is the corner no one thinks to look in." I learned my letters in stolen hours because a kitchen girl reading was considered a strange thing to allow, not because anyone forbade it outright, only because no one thought it worth encouraging. I stopped asking for more a long time ago, Elder, because asking never changed what I was given. I did not come to that high table seeking to be seen. I was put there to be laughed at. Whatever happened after was none of my arranging. Fenwin's face did not soften exactly, but something in it eased, the way a held breath eases. "That," she said, "is the most honest answer I have heard in this chamber in some years." She looked to Silas. "I do not know what to make of a bond born from a pitcher of wine, my king, but I know the girl standing in this doorway more clearly after 5 sentences than I know half the daughters of allied houses your father tried to match you with for a decade." Perhaps that is answer enough. The council did not resolve the matter that morning, not entirely. Such things are rarely settled in a single sitting, and I did not expect them to be, but I left that chamber with something I had not carried in a long time, the sense that I had been heard rather than merely observed. Silas did not rush what grew between us. He came to the kitchen some evenings, not as a king inspecting his hold, but as a man finding reasons to stand near a warmth he had waited 11 years to feel, and we talked of small things, of my mother, of his grandmother's stories, of the particular ache of growing up expected to need nothing. He told me once, low, almost embarrassed by his own honesty, that he had known something was different about me before that feast, some months earlier, when he had watched me steady a servant boy who dropped a tray rather than scold him, and had thought, without understanding why the thought lodged so deep, that is a kindness this hold does not deserve and does not know it has asterisk. He had not known then what the bond would feel like. He only knew, he said, that he had not been able to stop thinking of it. There were harder evenings too, and I do not wish to pretend there were not. A week after the council had heard us, I woke before dawn with the old fear sitting on my chest the way it had sat there every morning of my childhood. The fear that whatever kindness the world offered me was a debt that would eventually be called due, that I would wake one day to find the feast had been a dream, and the scullery my only truth again. I did not tell Silas of that fear at first. I had spent too many years keeping my worries to myself, folding them small and tucking them away where they would not become one more burden someone else had to carry on my behalf. He noticed anyway. That is, I have come to understand, simply what the bond does. It does not read a person's thoughts, but it reads the weather of them, the way a sailor reads a change in the wind before the storm itself arrives. He found me in the herb garden behind the kitchens on a gray morning, wringing my hands over nothing in particular, and he did not ask what troubled me. He only sat on the low stone wall beside me and waited, patient as still water, until I found words for it myself. "I keep waiting to wake up in the scullery," I admitted at last, ashamed of the admission even as I made it. "I keep waiting for someone to tell me it was a mistake, that the bond chose wrong, or that I imagined the warmth in the picture, or that a king cannot truly want a woman who owns nothing but a chipped cup and the clothes on her back." Silas was quiet a moment, turning that over with the same care he turned over every decision I had watched him make since the feast. "I cannot promise you the world will stop trying to tell you that," he said finally. "There will always be some Uspel, some Petrine, ready to remind you of what you once had none of. I can only promise that I will not be among them, and that I intend to spend a great many years proving it to you in small ways, not one grand gesture that fades by morning." He took my hand then, for the first time since the feast, careful and unhurried, as though asking permission with the mere fact of reaching. "You are not a debt that will be called due, Sable. You are the one thing in 11 years of ruling this hold that I never had to be told to want." I did not have an answer for that beyond the tightening warmth beneath my ribs, steady now, familiar, no longer a startling thing but something closer to a second heartbeat. I let him keep my hand. It was, I realized, the first time in my life I had let anyone hold something of mine without immediately bracing to have it taken back. I did not become a different woman at Duncrag. I still rose early from old habit, still found myself reaching for a broom before I remembered I no longer needed to. But I learned slowly to sit at tables rather than stand behind them, to speak first rather than wait to be addressed, to let a king cross a room for me and not flinch at the strangeness of being reached for instead of overlooked. On a colder evening some weeks later, Silas found me in the covered walk again, this time with a small carved wolf in his palm, worn smooth with age. "My grandmother's," he said, offering it to me. "She said a true mate bond announces itself in whatever way the two people need most." For her, it was a wolf appearing at the tree line every dusk for a month before she agreed to walk with my grandfather. For me, it was warmth in a pitcher's handle, at the one moment I most needed to notice you. He closed my fingers gently around the small carving. "I don't know what shape it will take for you to trust me completely. I only know I am not in a hurry to find out. I would rather learn it slowly and rightly than seize it quickly and lose what makes it true." I held the little wolf in my palm the whole walk back to my own small room that night, turning it over and over, feeling the same low warmth I had felt in the pitcher's handle settle into the grain of old wood instead. I set it on the narrow shelf above my bed, beside the one thing I owned that had been my mother's, a chipped blue cup, plain as the one I had poured from at that feast, and I thought that perhaps the two objects belonged together after all. The cup that had marked what I once was allowed to be, and the small carved wolf that marked what I was only now beginning to let myself become. Word of the feast traveled faster than I could have imagined a servant girl's fortunes might travel. Within a fortnight, messengers from 3 neighboring holds had arrived at Duncrag's gates under the thin pretense of trade business, though I came to understand, watching how carefully their eyes lingered on me across the yard, that they had truly come to see whether the rumor was real, whether the Alpha King of Duncrag had indeed abandoned 11 years of careful, childless solitude for a serving maid with no house, no dowry, no name that meant anything beyond these walls. One such visitor, A lord from the eastern holds named Bregan made the mistake of voicing his doubts within the hearing of the kitchen staff, believing perhaps that servants' ears did not carry tales the way noble mouths did. "A pretty face and an unlucky accident with a wine pitcher," he said to his own steward over breakfast in the guest hall, and Duncrag throws away a decade of careful alliances. I give the arrangement a season before the king comes to his senses. I heard of it before midday, the way I heard most things that happen under that roof, because kitchen girls and stable boys and laundresses talk among themselves in ways lords forget to guard against. I did not go to Sela's with it. I had learned, even in so short a time, that carrying tales to him about every doubting tongue in the hold would only teach him to see me as fragile, and I did not wish to be seen that way. Not by him, not by anyone, not ever again. Instead, I went about my morning as I always had, mending a torn hem in the small sewing room off the servants' hall, and let the words settle where they would. He found out anyway, as he seemed always to find out the things closest to my heart, though I never learned whether it was the bond itself that told him or simply his own habit of listening more carefully to his hold than most kings bothered to. He came to the sewing room that evening, ducking beneath the low doorway out of old habit, though he had long since stopped needing to duck for it, and sat across from me on an overturned basket while I finished my stitching. "Lord Bregan gives us a season," he said, without preamble, watching my needle move. "You heard, then?" "I hear most things that are said beneath my own roof, Sable. It is one of the few burdens of ruling that I have never learned to set down." He watched me tie off the thread before he spoke again. "Does it trouble you, what he said?" I considered lying, the old habit rising in me like a reflex, and then set it aside because I had promised myself, that first night in the covered walk, that I would not lie to this man even in small ways. "A little," I admitted, "not because I doubt what I feel, but because I know what it is to be spoken of as though I were not in the room to hear it. I have spent my whole life being discussed by people who did not think my opinion of myself mattered." "Then let us prove him wrong together, and let it cost him nothing worse than being wrong," Silas said. "I will not banish a man from my hold for doubting a bond he cannot see or feel. That would only teach my own people to fear voicing any thought that displeases me, and I have no wish to rule through fear. But I can invite Lord Bregan to remain at Duncrag through the turning of the season, and let him watch for himself whether my regard for you fades as conveniently as he predicts." A faint, private warmth touched his mouth, not quite a smile, something steadier than that. "I do not think he will enjoy being proven wrong nearly so much as I will enjoy proving him so." Lord Bregan did remain, as it happened, detained by trade matters that stretched longer than he had planned, and by the time the first frost silvered the fields around Duncrag, he had watched Silas seek me out often enough, watched the bond's steady warmth reflected plainly enough in the way the king's eyes found me across any room he entered, that he stopped voicing his season-long wager to anyone at all. He never apologized to me directly. Some men are not built for that particular honesty. But he began, I noticed, to address me as asterisk my lady rather than merely asterisk girl asterisk. And at Duncrag, among nobles who had spent their whole lives measuring worth by the smallness of such words, that shift was its own quiet apology. Not every reckoning that autumn was so gentle. Master Corin, whose satisfaction on the night of the feast had curdled so quickly into ash, came to me himself one gray afternoon in the kitchens, standing in the doorway the way I had once stood in the council chamber, hands folded, uncertain of his welcome. "I arranged that seating to embarrass you," he said, without softening it without excuse. "I have served this hold 20 years, and I let Lady Uspel's coin and her cousin's flattery convince me that a serving girl's dignity was a small enough thing to spend for a guest's amusement. I did not think of you as someone who could be wounded by it, because I had trained myself, over 20 years, not to think of servants as people who could be wounded by anything at all. I am ashamed of that now, more than I have been ashamed of anything in my service here." I set down the bread I had been kneading, flour still dusting my hands, and looked at him plainly. "You could have simply avoided me and let the shame stay quiet, Corin. Most men would have." "I considered it," he admitted. "But I would have to look at you across this hold for the rest of my service, and I did not wish to spend the rest of my service flinching from a woman I had wronged. I would rather say the thing plainly and let you decide what to do with it than carry the guilt silently and call that decency." I thought of Lady Uspel's stiff, half-formed apology in the covered walk, and found that Corin's plainer, harder honesty moved me more than her practiced courtesy ever could have. "Then I accept it," I said, "not because it undoes what happened, but because I would rather have a steward who can admit a wrong than one who only ever pretends he has none to admit." He nodded once sharply, the way men do when they are trying not to let relief show too plainly on their faces, and left me to my bread. We did not speak of the feast again after that, but I noticed, in the weeks that followed, that he began quietly steering the youngest kitchen girls away from the kind of errands that might once have exposed them to a visiting noble's cruelty, the way he had never once thought to steer me away from mine. It was not restitution, precisely, but it was something, and I had learned by then not to dismiss the something in favor of demanding a nothing that never arrives. Winter came to Dunkraghard that year, the kind of cold that drove even the hounds to sleep pressed against the hearthstones, and it was in that deep cold that Silas asked me, at last, to walk with him to the old watchtower above the eastern wall, the one place in the hold, he told me, where his grandmother had first told him the story of her own bond. We climbed the narrow stair together in silence, my hand in his for balance on the worn stone steps, until we reached the small platform where the wind cut sharper and the whole valley of Dunkrag spread out below us, white and quiet under a sky just beginning to clear of snow. "My grandmother stood here the night she decided to trust my grandfather," Silas said, looking out over the valley rather than at me, as though the words came easier facing outward. "She was not a serving girl. She was a hunter's daughter from the far side of the ridge, and she had no reason to trust a young alpha who had not yet proven himself to his own pack, let alone to her. But she told me once that she stood on this platform and asked herself a single question, not whether he was worthy of her, but whether the life he was offering her was one she actually wanted to live, apart from the bond entirely. She said the bond could tell her he was hers. It could not tell her whether she wanted the particular shape of the life a crown would ask her to carry. And what did she decide? That she wanted it, not because the bond compelled her, but because when she imagined refusing him, she found she would be refusing herself something she already wanted before the bond ever confirmed it. He turned to me then, and in the cold his breath showed pale between us, and his eyes held none of the crown's weight I had first seen in them at the feast, only the plain, unguarded want of a man asking rather than a king declaring. "I am not asking you to answer that question tonight, Sable. I know I promised you slowness, and I intend to keep that promise. I only wanted you to stand where she stood, and ask yourself, in your own time, whether the life beside me is one you would choose even if the bond had never spoken a single word in that pitcher's handle." I looked out over the valley a long while before I answered, the cold biting at my hands despite his cloak wrapped over my shoulders, and I thought of the scullery and the chipped blue cup, and every year I had spent making myself small enough that no one would ever think to ask me what I wanted at all. "I have never once in my life been asked what I would choose," I said finally. "Only what I would endure. I find I like the asking a great deal more than I expected to." I looked at him. "I would choose this, not only the bond. You, plainly, and the valley, and even the cold on this tower, if it means standing here being asked rather than told." Something in his face broke open then, not with the drama of the feast, not with 400 watching eyes, but quietly, privately, the way dawn breaks over a valley with no one awake yet to witness it. And he did not kiss me, not that night, mindful still of the slowness I had asked for and he had promised to honor, but he drew me against his side against the wind, and we stood on that tower until the cold drove us down, saying very little more because there was, for once in my life. Nothing more that needed saying. I did not know, that first night at the feast, everything a bond like ours would ask of either of us in the seasons to come. The council's doubts, Bregan's wager, Corin's plain and difficult honesty, the long cold climb to a tower where a question mattered more than any answer the bond alone could give. I knew only that a king had crossed his own hall for me, had taken a pitcher from my hands and filled my cup instead of his own, and that somewhere beneath my ribs a restless thing had finally, quietly, come to rest. That was enough to begin with. I found, lying awake in the months that followed with a small carved wolf on the shelf above my bed, that I no longer wished to disappear into any corner of Duncrag. I wished, for the first time in my life, to be found, and more than that, to keep being found, morning after ordinary morning, by the one man who had never once needed the bond to teach him to look for me.